Alright, a couple little housekeeping items here on the Arctic Cat. One of which is the on this side here I had this washer that was on there when I got the machine. It's not the right washer because it doesn't allow you to snap the rubber end cap on to protect the axle and the bearing in there. There is an O-ring in there and sealant, but needless to say, I want to be able to put one of these Arctic Cat washers on, which I ordered. But because this is the actual original part for the original axles, like what was on the other side of this machine, it won't fit on this side because this side has the aftermarket axle, which is actually larger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bore this out large enough so that it will fit on there. And then I also have this castle nut that I actually borrowed off of the Prairie 400, Kawasaki Prairie 400. I'm going to put that back on the Kawasaki where it belongs and install another one of these self-locking nuts that I picked up, which is the correct size for this application. So this basically, once you get to a certain point, these little crimps on the end here actually cause this nut to bind, so that when you tighten it on, it's hard to tighten, but it also tends to lock in place and doesn't want to loosen. So to straighten this out, I've got to get this washer, the hole in this washer, bored out to that size. Alright, so now that locking nut is installed, I just put the rubber cap on, and we're good to go. Now, up until now, I haven't really talked about the engine, because the engine was the one thing on this thing that seemed to be really running well. But I did realize shortly after getting it that one of the issues was there was a small oil leak down below here, and that leak is actually where this case meets the side of the engine block, and there's a gasket actually in there. Now I spoke to one of the techs at an Arctic Cat dealer, and he said in absence of being able to procure the gasket locally or easily, I could get away with just taking it apart, cleaning it up, and putting some RTV sealant on there, form a gasket type of product. So that's probably what I'm going to end up doing, and I do want to resolve that issue because it's enough of a leak that it's annoying, to say the least. And then the other issue, which I discovered, was that after riding it and having it parked, I couldn't help but notice that the oil level, which is actually viewed in this window right here, is right up to the full mark. And if I had just recently topped it off, that would be a good thing. The problem is that since it had a small oil leak and I was running it, that, if anything, that level should have went down. And what I believe has happened is, I believe that either one or two things: either coolant from the cooling system has gotten into the crankcase because of a flaw in the engine, or gasoline has gotten into the crankcase. And that's the more likely scenario, because the oil that is in the crankcase right now that leaked out doesn't look contaminated with coolant. And it's a known issue that sometimes, if the float sticks on this carburetor, what'll happen is the gasoline will actually overflow and run into the crankcase. So that's what I suspect may have happened here. So I'm going to have to drain the crankcase to open it up anyways. But I'm also going to pull the carburetor out and clean the carburetor, because I haven't cleaned the carburetor since I got this machine. And this machine did have some stale gas in it, and all I did was I drained off the bowl in the carburetor, drained out the tank, and refilled it with fresh gas. And that's all I did. The other reason I want to take the carburetor apart and clean it is because I'm not convinced that that carburetor is running exactly right. I can use the primer to get the engine started when it's cold, but up here on the top, on the left-hand side, there's this lever right here, which appears to be the choke lever. And I could never quite figure out which way was on and which way was off on the choke. But it certainly appears like this is on and this is off. But the interesting thing is, once I get the engine started and warmed up, if I put the choke on or start to push the choke lever up to this position, the engine starts to actually race, which is not what I would expect to happen. I also found that I had to mess with this adjustment right here in order to get the engine to idle properly. So I'm not even sure if this is an idle speed adjustment or whether or not this is an air-fuel mixture adjustment. So once I get the carburetor out and get a good look at it, I'll be able to tell what this actually does. I'll also be able to tell what position on that lever up there is choke on and choke off. And I'll also be able to just make sure that all the passages and everything are clean. There might be just a couple of small tiny passages clogged in there that might be causing the problems. I'll also be able to get an idea of what it looks like as far as the float seat and all that. If that looks like it's in good condition, that might also explain how the float might be sticking and causing this, what I believe is gasoline going into the crankcase. So I think for now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the carburetor off so that I can get that, start soaking that. Another bit of evidence that supports my theory about the gasoline going into the crankcase through a stuck float is the fact that my new fuel gauge that I've installed on here is now showing that the tank's almost empty. And the interesting thing is that I recall that it was not that low on fuel when I parked it last weekend. So fuel went somewhere, most likely in the crankcase. So first thing I got to do before I take the carburetor out is I've got to shut off the fuel at the tank. And unfortunately, the shutoff is kind of buried up in there. It's a bad, hard place to get to, which is probably why a lot of people don't bother shutting them off when they park them, and probably why a lot of people have experienced this problem when they've parked them for long periods of time. The way that is supposedly supposed to work is that if the tab, which is broken off on this one, is pointed horizontally, then that's the off position. And then if it's pointed one direction is on and the other direction is reserve. So I'm going to try and get the small wrench on there to grab a hold of it and put it into the off position. And then I'll have to take the hose off here at the carburetor and see how much fuel I can get to come out. If it stops flowing, then I'll know I have it in the correct off position. Also, the air box and air filter assembly, the complete assembly was missing when I got this machine. So this basically, which is supposed to connect to the air box assembly, was just left open, and then somebody stuck a piece of Schedule 40 PVC pipe in here to act as, like, I'm not sure what they were thinking, but they just stuck that in there, and that's been wide open. So there's another good reason why you might get dirt contaminants in the carburetor. But I think this carburetor's problems are more related to just stale fuel being left in the machine. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and shut that off and see what happens. Okay, I've removed this rubber intake boot, and that exposes the back of the carburetor, and the first thing I noticed is that there's no conventional choke butterfly in there, and when I work the choke lever I can't see anything moving, but I can definitely hear something opening and closing. So there's some sort of an orifice in there that's being activated by this, and I guess I'm going to have to wait until I get the carburetor apart to figure that one out. And then the fuel is shut off in that middle position. Just a little bit of fuel came out of the line and it stopped, so that's good. It is dripping just a little bit, so I'm going to keep that bottle on there just so I'm not dripping gas all over the ground. And got the fuel line disconnected. Now I'm going to loosen up this clamp right here and see if I can't pop that carburetor out into a position where it'll make it easier for me to disconnect the throttle cable. Okay, I've popped the carburetor off of that, and now I've moved over to the other side and I've tilted it up. Now I have easy access to these 4 screws, which removes this cover, which is how you disconnect the throttle cable. And also now I can see that adjustment on the other side, that thumb screw type of adjustment attached to a cable, actually goes right into the bottom of this. So this is more than likely going to confirm the fact that that is an idle adjustment. And that's how you would adjust your low speed idle. Okay, I've got that cover off. There was a nice little spider web in there. Clean that out. And now I can see the anatomy of how this idle screw assembly works. Basically, as that screw is turned in, it just pushes on the bottom of this cam assembly, and that causes the throttle butterfly to open slightly more. And then coming down from the top here, you can see the actual throttle cable coming in and it hooks to the same assembly. So that is definitely a idle screw adjustment that's attached to the other end of that cable. So now I'm going to engage the throttle, and when I engage the throttle and then I stick my finger in there to keep the throttle from going back and then release the tension on the cable, I should be able to actually release it from the that assembly. So I got to put the video down for that. A pair of long nose pliers like this works really great, and it helps you bring the cable down into the correct position so that this little end piece right here disengages from the slot near this hole on this throttle assembly. Now I can get this throttle cable removed from the rest of the carburetor. So this little tiny brass piece is actually what was on the end of that cable there and what went into that hole on that plate. And once you rotate it to the correct position, that comes right off the cable, and that allows you to just simply pull up and pull the cable straight out of the carburetor. And now that's disconnected. Okay, I got the carburetor out. The only thing left now to separate it from the machine is to remove this choke cable. And that goes in on the side here. I'm not quite sure how that's connected. So I'm going to take this cover off, remove these 4 screws and take this top cover off and see if that gives me an indication of how to take this apart. Okay, there are 2 small hoses right here. They appear to be vents. And one of them is short because it's either been cut or broke off. And where those actually run is they run up to the top here and they come out the back. And they actually engage the frame at these 2 points right here. And I'm not sure if they actually eventually connected to the airbox assembly, which was missing when I got the machine, or not. I have a suspicion that they didn't. I think that they just probably ran here and stopped. And the idea being is that they were venting the carburetor at a high point. And now I wanted to see if I can't figure out how to take apart, remove this or disconnect this choke cable. So I took the 4 screws off that hold this cover on. 2 of them came up pretty easily. 2 of them were a little more stubborn. I had to get some pliers to grip them and get them broken free. And then when I took the cover off, which is right here, I immediately found that this large spring was sitting in there just broken. And what this spring does, from what I can see, is it goes down into this slot right here. And then the other end of the spring is supposed to engage this nipple on the inside of the cover. And what that would do is that spring would give downward force to this diaphragm assembly. And I'm not sure exactly what the principle is here behind the operation, but this must somehow meter the air flow into the carburetor, and probably has something to do with also the way that the choke works. But needless to say, with a spring broken like that, who knows how this was running. So it certainly would make sense to me why this wasn't working properly. Okay, now that I've lifted this up, I can see that this actually is almost like a butterfly. And so this butterfly would act as a choke. It would meter the amount of airflow into the engine. Not only that, but I can see actually it's also attached to a needle jet or some sort of a shaft. So this also, and it's a tapered needle that goes into that hole right there, which looks almost like it's the main jet. So that's very interesting to say the least. I can see on the inside here, it is dirty. Oh, here's an idiot telemarketer calling me. Now with that diaphragm assembly removed, I can actually see in this tiny hole right here, this small hole right here, I can actually see there's a plunger that opens and closes depending on which position the choke lever is in. So there's your choke apparatus is right there. So now I don't see any way to disconnect that cable from inside here, as I supposed I might have seen. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pop this rubber boot back carefully to see whether or not that will expose the way to disconnect this cable. Okay, upon closer examination, I discovered that this plastic nut right here actually unscrews from the carburetor body. There's a little tiny ball on the end of the cable. That ball actually goes in the hole on this little doohickey here. There's a slot that allows the cable to slip in there. This little doohickey, it's kind of like a plunger with a pin on the end of it, actually goes right down in this hole right here on the carburetor, which when I look down there I can see it is full of dirt and grime. So the carburetor is in definite need of cleaning, to say the least.